Sergeant James "Jim" Hutchinson had been a Marine for 3 years when he found himself on a nameless ridge in the Pacific, staring into the darkness and wondering if he would survive the night. It was August 1944, and his unit had been fighting on Guam for 2 brutal weeks. The Japanese were desperate, cornered, and that made them more dangerous than ever. Jim had heard the stories about Banzai charges, about waves of screaming enemy soldiers charging American positions in suicidal attacks. He'd heard that some positions had been overrun, that entire squads had been wiped out in minutes, but he'd also heard about a weapon that could stop these charges dead in their tracks. The M45 Maxim mount, better known as the Quad-50. Jim was from a small farming town in Iowa, a place where everyone knew everyone, and the most exciting thing that happened was the county fair every summer. He joined the Marines in 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, looking for adventure and a way out of the endless cycle of planting and harvesting. He got more adventure than he bargained for. By 1944, he'd fought on Guadalcanal, survived the hell of Tarawa, and seen things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But nothing had prepared him for what was about to happen on that ridge in Guam. The Quad-50 was a beast of a weapon. 4 M2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns mounted on a single rotating platform, originally designed for anti-aircraft defense. Each gun could fire up to 550 rounds per minute, which meant the entire system could put out over 2,000 rounds per minute when all 4 guns were firing. The guns were arranged in a square pattern, and the mount could rotate 360 degrees, making it deadly against aircraft or ground targets. The Marines had discovered that while the Quad-50 was good for shooting down planes, it was absolutely devastating against infantry charges. Jim's position was on the northern edge of the Marine perimeter, overlooking a valley that intelligence said was filled with Japanese troops preparing for a counterattack. His squad consisted of 12 men, all veterans of previous campaigns, all exhausted and worn down by weeks of constant combat. They dug in as best they could, creating foxholes and connecting trenches, establishing fields of fire and fallback positions. But the key to their defense was the Quad-50, positioned in a reinforced emplacement with sandbags piled high around it for protection. The crew operating the Quad-50 consisted of 3 men: Corporal Danny Martinez from Texas, who served as the gunner, Private First Class Robert "Bobby" Chen, a Chinese-American kid from San Francisco who acted as the loader, and Private Eddie Walsh from Brooklyn, who fed ammunition and spotted targets. Jim had worked with these men before, knew they were good at their jobs, knew they wouldn't panic when things got bad, and things were definitely about to get bad. As the sun set on August 10, 1944, the jungle around them came alive with sounds, not the normal sounds of birds and insects, but something else. Movement, lots of movement, the rustling of hundreds of men moving through the undergrowth, the clink of equipment, the whispered commands in Japanese. Jim could feel the tension rising in his position. Every Marine was checking his weapon, making sure he had plenty of ammunition, saying quiet prayers, or just thinking about home. Around 2200 hours, the Japanese artillery started. Not a heavy barrage, they didn't have enough ammunition left for that, but enough to keep the Marines' heads down and cover the sound of troops massing in the valley below. Jim huddled in his foxhole as shells exploded around the perimeter, sending dirt and shrapnel flying. The barrage lasted for 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the explosions. Jim crawled to the edge of his foxhole and peered into the darkness. The moon was just a sliver, barely providing any light, but his eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and he could see movement in the valley, lots of movement. His heart started pounding. This was it. This was the Banzai charge they'd been warned about. "Hutchinson, you seeing this?" whispered Corporal Tom Bradley, who was in the foxhole next to Jim's. Bradley was a veteran from North Carolina, steady and reliable. "Yeah, I see it. Looks like the whole Japanese army down there. Martinez, you ready with that Quad-50? Jim called out softly to the gun emplacement about 30 yards behind their forward positions. "Ready as we'll ever be, Sarge," Martinez replied, his Texas drawl calm and steady. "We got about 3,000 rounds loaded and ready. More in reserve if we need it." 3,000 rounds sounded like a lot, but Jim knew that with the Quad-50's rate of fire, they could burn through that in less than 2 minutes if they weren't careful. They'd need to fire in controlled bursts, make every shot count. But if the intelligence estimates were right, if there were really 500 to 1,000 Japanese soldiers massing for this attack, They were going to need every single round they had. At 22:45 hours, the Japanese made their move. It started with a single scream, a high-pitched battle cry that was picked up and repeated by hundreds of voices. Then they came, pouring out of the valley like a human tsunami, running full speed up the hill toward the Marine positions. In the dim moonlight, Jim could see them, a mass of humanity, many carrying rifles with fixed bayonets, some with swords, some with grenades strapped to their bodies. They were screaming, a continuous roar of voices that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Open fire!" Jim shouted, and the Marine line erupted with gunfire. M1 Garands barked, bars hammered out automatic fire, carbines cracked. But there were so many Japanese soldiers that it barely seemed to slow them down. For every man that fell, 2 more took his place. They were 50 yards away, then 40, then 30. "Martinez, light them up!" Jim screamed over the sound of gunfire. The Quad-50 opened fire, and the world transformed into hell. The sound was deafening, like standing inside a thunderstorm. 4 streams of 50 caliber tracers lanced out into the darkness, creating a wall of fire that swept across the charging Japanese troops. The effect was immediate and devastating. The large 50 caliber rounds, each one nearly 4 inches long and weighing about 2 ounces, could punch through engine blocks, could tear through multiple bodies with a single shot. When 4 of these guns fired simultaneously, they created an almost solid wall of lead that nothing could penetrate. The Japanese charge hit that wall and simply disintegrated. Men were literally torn apart by the massive rounds. Bodies flew backward, limbs were severed. Entire ranks of attackers were scythed down like wheat before a harvester. Martinez traversed the guns slowly from left to right, the 4 barrels spitting fire, the tracer rounds looking like laser beams in the darkness. The noise was incredible, a continuous roar that drowned out everything else. Bobby Chen was working like a machine, feeding ammunition belts into the 4 guns, making sure they never ran dry. Eddie Walsh was spotting targets, directing Martinez's fire toward concentrations of enemy troops. The 3 of them worked in perfect coordination, a well-oiled machine of destruction. Jim watched in horrified fascination as the Quad-50 did its work. He'd seen plenty of combat, had seen men die in dozens of different ways, but he'd never seen anything like this. The Japanese kept coming, kept charging into that wall of fire, even as their comrades fell around them. Some made it to within 20 yards of the Marine line before being cut down, but none made it past the Quad-50's field of fire. The charge lasted for 15 minutes, though it felt like hours to Jim. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers tried to break through, tried to reach the Marine positions, but the Quad-50 stopped them all. Martinez fired in controlled bursts, 5 to 10 seconds of firing, followed by brief pauses to let the barrels cool and to assess the situation. But even with these pauses, the gun was putting out an enormous volume of fire. "We're at half ammunition," Bobby Chen shouted over the roar of the guns. "Keep firing," Jim yelled back. "They're starting to break." He was right. The Japanese charge was faltering. The survivors were falling back, dragging wounded comrades, leaving hundreds of bodies scattered across the hillside. Some continued firing from whatever cover they could find, but the organized attack had been broken. The Quad-50 had done what it was designed to do, and it had done it perfectly. As the sound of gunfire began to diminish, Jim could hear the moans of the wounded Japanese and American alike. His ears were ringing from the Quad-50's thunder, and his hands were shaking from adrenaline. He did a quick head count of his squad. 2 men wounded, neither seriously. Considering what they'd just faced, it was a miracle. "Martinez, status," Jim called out. "Gun's still operational, Sarge. We burned through about 1,800 rounds. Barrels are hot as hell, but they'll cool down. Bobby and Eddie are fine. No casualties." Jim let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. They'd survived. The Quad-50 had saved them all. But the night wasn't over. Around 0100 hours, the Japanese tried again. This time they approached more cautiously, using the terrain for cover, trying to infiltrate rather than charging en masse. But they'd lost their element of surprise, and the Marines were ready. Every time a group of Japanese soldiers tried to advance, the Quad-50 would engage them, and the concentrated firepower would drive them back or cut them down. Jim spent the night moving between positions, checking on his men, coordinating with other squad leaders, making sure ammunition was distributed where it was needed. The Quad-50 became the anchor of their entire defensive line. Whenever a section of the perimeter was threatened, Martinez would swing the guns around and pour fire into the enemy concentration. The psychological effect was as important as the physical damage. The Japanese soldiers learned quickly that advancing into the Quad-50's field of fire meant certain death, and even the most fanatical warriors hesitated when faced with that kind of firepower. By dawn on August 11th, the Japanese attacks had ceased. As the sun rose, Jim could see the full extent of the carnage. Bodies littered the hillside, hundreds of them, most killed by the Quad-50's massive rounds. The ground in front of the gun emplacement was torn up, vegetation shredded, earth churned into mud by the volume of fire. It looked like a slaughterhouse. The Marines spent the morning consolidating their position and treating the wounded. Intelligence officers came forward to assess the damage and count the enemy dead. The initial count was staggering. Over 400 Japanese soldiers killed, with an unknown number wounded who'd been dragged away during the night. The Marine casualties were remarkably light. 7 killed, 23 wounded, most of those from artillery fire rather than the Banzai charges. Captain Richard Morrison, the company commander, came to inspect Jim's position. He was a tall man from Virginia, a career Marine who'd seen action in World War I and had come out of retirement to fight in this war. He stood looking at the field of dead Japanese soldiers, shaking his head slowly. "Sergeant Hutchinson, what happened here?" he asked. Jim explained the night's events, describing how the Japanese had charged in waves, how the Quad-50 had broken each attack, how Martinez and his crew had performed brilliantly under pressure. Morrison listened carefully, occasionally asking questions, taking notes. "That Quad-50, Morrison said finally. "I've seen it used before, but never quite like this. How many rounds did you expend?" "About 2,400 rounds of 50 cal, sir, plus several thousand rounds of rifle and machine gun ammunition from the rest of the squad." Morrison nodded. "The Quad-50 is designed to shoot down aircraft. Putting one in a ground defense role is unconventional, but clearly effective." He paused, looking at the gun emplacement. "I'm putting you and Corporal Martinez in for commendations. This defensive action probably saved the entire northern perimeter from being overrun." Over the next few days, word of what had happened on Jim's Ridge spread through the Marine Division. Other units wanted to know more about how the Quad-50 had been employed, what tactics had worked, what lessons could be learned. Jim found himself giving informal briefings to officers and NCOs from other companies, describing the engagement in detail. The key lessons, as Jim explained them, were positioning and fire discipline. The Quad-50 needed to be placed where it had clear fields of fire and good visibility. It needed to be protected with sandbags or other fortifications because it was a priority target for enemy artillery and mortars. And most importantly, the crew needed to fire in controlled bursts rather than continuous fire, both to conserve ammunition and to prevent the barrels from overheating. Corporal Martinez became something of a celebrity among the Marines. Men would come by just to look at the Quad-50, to touch it, to hear Martinez describe how he'd fired it during the Banzai charge. Martinez took it all in stride, deflecting praise to Bobby Chen and Eddie Walsh, insisting that the gun was only as good as its crew. "It's not about being a hero," Martinez told Jim one evening as they sat cleaning the Quad-50's barrels. "It's about doing your job and not panicking when things get crazy. That gun, she's a monster, but she needs someone who can control her, who can make every burst count. Bobby and Eddie, they're the real heroes. Without them keeping the ammunition flowing, that gun would have been useless." Jim understood what Martinez meant. Combat wasn't about individual heroics or glory. It was about teamwork, about every man doing his job so the whole unit could survive. The riflemen in the foxholes, the bar gunners providing suppressing fire, the officers coordinating the defense, the ammunition bearers keeping everyone supplied. They all played crucial roles. The Quad-50 was impressive, but it was just one part of a larger defensive system. The fighting on Guam continued for another 2 weeks before the island was secured. Jim's unit was involved in several more engagements, but none as dramatic as that night on the ridge. The Quad-50 saw action multiple times, always with devastating effect against Japanese positions and counterattacks. By the time the island was declared secure on August 10th, exactly 1 month after the invasion began, the Quad-50 in Jim's sector had expended over 8,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition and had been credited with stopping at least 3 major Japanese attacks. After Guam was secured, Jim had some time to reflect on what had happened. He wrote letters home to his family in Iowa. Though he couldn't tell them much about the specific battles due to censorship, he wrote about the weather, about the jungle, about his fellow Marines, but not about the bodies piled in front of the Quad-50 emplacement or the screams of dying men, or the nightmares that woke him every night. One evening, Jim sat down with Tom Bradley and talked about the Banzai charge. Bradley had been one of the riflemen in the forward positions, one of the men who'd fired into the charging Japanese until his rifle barrel was too hot to touch. "You think they knew they were going to die?" Bradley asked. "Those Japanese soldiers, I mean. They kept coming even when they could see what the Quad-50 was doing to them." "Why?" Jim thought about it for a long time before answering. "I think they were following orders. I think their officers told them to take this ridge or die trying, and that's what they did. They were brave men, Tom. Misguided maybe, fighting for the wrong side, but brave. They deserve that much recognition. You feel bad about killing them. I feel bad that we're in a situation where killing them was necessary, but I don't regret doing my duty. If we hadn't stopped that charge, they would have overrun our position and killed us all. The Quad-50 saved our lives." Bradley nodded slowly. "That gun? I've never seen anything like it. It was like watching a meat grinder, but I'm glad it was on our side." The Quad-50 mount that had defended Jim's ridge was eventually moved to other positions as the Marines prepared for future operations. The same principles that had worked on Guam were applied in other battles throughout the Pacific. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Quad-50s were positioned at key defensive points, ready to meet Japanese Banzai charges with overwhelming firepower. The weapon's reputation grew with each successful engagement, but the Quad-50 wasn't perfect. It was heavy, difficult to move, and required a lot of ammunition to be effective. It was vulnerable to artillery fire and air attack when positioned in exposed locations. The crews operating these weapons were at high risk because the gun's position would be revealed as soon as it opened fire, making it a priority target for enemy mortars and artillery. Many Quad-50 crews became casualties, killed or wounded while defending their positions. Danny Martinez survived the war, as did Bobby Chen and Eddie Walsh. The three of them remained friends for decades afterward, attending Marine Corps reunions and staying in touch through letters and phone calls. They would tell stories about that night on the ridge in Guam, about how the Quad-50 had saved an entire Marine company from being overrun. The story became part of Marine Corps lore, an example of how superior firepower and good tactics could overcome numerical superiority. Jim Hutchinson also survived the war. He fought through Iwo Jima and was preparing for the invasion of Japan when the atomic bombs were dropped and the war ended. He returned to Iowa, married his high school sweetheart, and took over his father's farm. He rarely talked about his war experiences with people who hadn't been there. How could he explain what it was like to stand on that ridge and watch hundreds of men die in front of his position? How could he describe the sound of the Quad-50, the smell of cordite and blood, the sight of bodies torn apart by massive 50 caliber rounds? But he did talk to other veterans, men who understood. At VFW meetings and Marine Corps reunions, he would share his stories, always emphasizing the bravery of the men who'd served with him, always crediting the Quad-50 and its crew for saving his life and the lives of his squad. He kept in touch with Martinez, Chen, and Walsh, exchanging Christmas cards and occasional phone calls, maintaining the bonds forged in combat. In the 1970s, a military historian contacted Jim, asking for details about the defense of the ridge on Guam. The historian was writing a book about innovative weapons employment during World War II and wanted to include a chapter on the Quad-50. Jim agreed to be interviewed, and he spent several hours describing the battle in detail, answering technical questions about the weapon's performance and tactical employment. The historian asked Jim if he thought the Quad-50 had been the decisive factor in stopping the Japanese Banzai charge. Jim thought carefully before answering. The Quad-50 was crucial, no doubt about it. Without that gun, we probably would have been overrun. But it wasn't just the gun, it was the crew operating it. The Marines in the foxholes providing supporting fire, the officers who'd positioned us correctly, the supply personnel who made sure we had enough ammunition. War isn't about single weapons or single heroes. It's about systems, about everyone doing their part. The Quad-50 was an important part of our defensive system, maybe the most important part that night, but it was still just one part. The historian pressed further. But the firepower advantage must have been overwhelming. 4 50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously. That's something the Japanese had no answer for. True, Jim agreed. But overwhelming firepower only matters if you use it correctly. If Martinez had panicked and just held down the triggers until the ammunition ran out, we might have been in trouble when the second or third wave came. He fired in controlled bursts, conserved ammunition, picked his targets carefully, That discipline, that training, that made the difference. The book was published in 1978 and included a detailed account of the defense of Jim's Ridge, based on his interview and after-action reports from the Marine Corps archives. The chapter described how the Quad-50 had fired approximately 2,400 rounds during the initial Banzai charge, how the concentrated fire had created a killing zone that the Japanese couldn't penetrate, how the psychological impact of the weapon had deterred subsequent attacks. It became a case study in the effective employment of heavy weapons in defensive positions. As Jim grew older, he reflected more and more on that night in August 1944. He'd been 24 years old, a farm kid from Iowa who'd never imagined he'd be responsible for directing fire that would kill hundreds of men. The experience had changed him fundamentally, had given him a perspective on life and death that civilians couldn't understand. He'd learned that bravery came in many forms, that technology could be decisive in warfare, that good leadership and training could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. He also learned about the cost of war. Those 400 Japanese soldiers who died on that hillside had been someone's sons, brothers, fathers. They died following orders, doing their duty as they understood it, fighting for their country. Jim didn't hate them. He couldn't. They'd been soldiers like him, caught up in a war that none of them had started, but all of them had to fight. The Quad-50 itself became a symbol of American firepower and technological superiority during World War II. While it was originally designed for anti-aircraft work, its employment in ground defense roles demonstrated the adaptability of American weapons and tactics. The lessons learned from engagements like the one on Guam influenced military doctrine for decades, emphasizing the importance of concentrated firepower, proper positioning, and fire discipline. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the Battle for Guam, Jim returned to the island for a memorial ceremony. He was 74 years old, accompanied by his wife and 2 of his children. The ridge where he'd fought looked different now, overgrown with vegetation, peaceful, with no trace of the battle that had occurred there. A small memorial had been erected, listing the names of Marines and Japanese soldiers who died in the fighting. Jim stood at the memorial for a long time, remembering. He remembered the sound of the Quad-50, the screams of attacking soldiers, the smell of gunpowder and death. He remembered Martinez and Chen and Walsh working their gun with professional precision while hell erupted around them. He remembered Tom Bradley and the other riflemen firing steadily into the charging enemy despite their fear. A Japanese veteran approached him at the memorial. The man was elderly, probably about Jim's age, walking with a cane. Through an interpreter, he explained that he'd been part of the attack on the ridge, had somehow survived and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. "I remember that gun," the Japanese veteran said through the interpreter. "We called it the 4 Dragons. We were told to take the ridge, but when those 4 guns started firing, it was like running into a wall of steel. I saw my entire platoon die in seconds. I survived only because I fell into a shell crater and stayed there until dawn." Jim looked at the old Japanese soldier, seeing the same memories reflected in his eyes, the same haunted look that Jim saw in his own mirror. "I'm sorry," Jim said. "I'm sorry for what happened to your friends." The Japanese veteran shook his head. "We were soldiers. We did our duty. You did yours. Many died on both sides. Now we are old men who remember." He extended his hand, and Jim shook it. 2 old soldiers, former enemies, acknowledging their shared experience of that terrible night 50 years ago. Jim Hutchinson died in 2003 at the age of 83. His obituary in the local Iowa newspaper mentioned his service as a Marine in World War II, his participation in several major Pacific campaigns, and his successful career as a farmer after the war. It didn't mention the Banzai charge, or the Quad-50, or the 400 Japanese soldiers who died trying to take his position. Those details were in his Marine Corps records, in military history books, in the memories of the few veterans who were still alive to remember. But the story lived on. In Marine Corps training schools, instructors still taught the lessons learned from that engagement on Guam. They talked about the importance of positioning heavy weapons for maximum effect, about fire discipline and ammunition conservation, about the psychological impact of overwhelming firepower. They used the defense of Jim's Ridge as an example of how a small unit with the right weapons and tactics could defeat a numerically superior force. Danny Martinez died in 2008, Bobby Chen in 2011, and Eddie Walsh in 2015. With their passing, The last of the Quad-50 crew that had defended that ridge in Guam were gone. But their actions on that August night in 1944 remained part of Marine Corps history, a demonstration of courage under fire and the effective employment of heavy weapons in defensive combat. The Quad-50 itself became obsolete after World War II, replaced by more modern anti-aircraft systems. But during the war, it had proven itself as a devastating weapon against ground targets, particularly against massed infantry attacks. The employment of Quad-50s in defensive positions became standard practice in the Pacific theater, and countless American lives were saved by the weapon's awesome firepower. Looking back from the perspective of decades, the defense of that ridge on Guam stands as a testament to several important principles of warfare. First, that technology matters. The Quad-50's concentrated firepower gave the Marines an enormous advantage over their attackers. Second, that training and discipline matter. Martinez's controlled firing and the crew's coordination made the difference between success and failure. Third, that courage comes in many forms. The riflemen in their foxholes, the ammunition bearers under fire, the wounded who refused evacuation, all displayed bravery equal to that of the Quad-50 crew. But perhaps most importantly, the battle demonstrated that wars are won not by individual weapons or individual heroes, but by systems and teams working together toward a common goal. The Quad-50 was crucial, but it was effective only because it was part of a larger defensive system that included riflemen, machine gunners, mortars, artillery, and officers coordinating the entire effort. Remove any one component, and the defense might have failed. That night in August 1944, one Marine unit's Quad-50 line stopped a Japanese Banzai charge before it reached their positions. 4 machine guns, firing in controlled bursts, created a wall of steel that hundreds of attacking soldiers couldn't penetrate. It was a demonstration of American firepower, tactical skill, and the courage of men who stood their ground against overwhelming odds. The Japanese soldiers who died in that attack displayed their own form of courage, following orders and fighting to the death for their country. Both sides showed bravery. One side had better weapons and tactics. That was the reality of warfare in the Pacific, brutal, unforgiving, decided often by which side could bring more firepower to bear at the decisive moment. The Quad-50 gave the Marines that firepower advantage, and men like Hutchinson, Danny Martinez, Chen, and Eddie Walsh used it effectively to save their own lives and the lives of their comrades. It wasn't glorious or romantic. It was just soldiers doing their jobs, using the tools they'd been given, trying to survive another night in a war that none of them had wanted, but all of them had to fight. The legacy of that night lived on in military doctrine, in history books, in the memories of the few veterans who survived to tell the story, and in the quiet moments when old men remembered their youth and the terrible things they'd seen and done. Hutchinson would think back to that ridge in Guam, to the sound of the Quad-50 firing, to the sight of Martinez and his crew working their gun with deadly precision, to the moment when technology and training and courage combined to stop an enemy attack that should have overwhelmed them. That was how one U.S. Marine unit's Quad-50 line stopped a Japanese Banzai charge before it reached them, not through individual heroism or miracle, but through superior firepower properly employed by well-trained men who refused to panic in the face of a terrifying enemy attack. It was a small moment in a vast war, but for the men who were there it was everything. It was the difference between life and death, between victory and defeat, between survival and annihilation, and they never forgot it.